Well, I am honored to be interviewing Gary Wayne today. He's an incredible researcher and the author of the insightful book, Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Gary, thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me. Excited to be here and excited to talk about some of the things that we just might get into. And I think the audience may find it interesting as well. At least I hope so.
Yeah, definitely. I've really enjoyed reading through your book. And I've really been looking forward to this interview, really looking forward to what you have to say. So I'm basically going to ask you some specific questions and then just get out of the way so I can enjoy listening to you share. Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. Let's get into this. So Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep." Some very famous scripture there that many have heard. And it kind of seems like more and more Bible scholars and people are talking about Genesis chapter 1, specifically what might have happened between verse 1 and 2, i.e. the gap theory, as many call it. So I'd really love to know kind of how do you interpret, Gary, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you know, it's one of those questions that certainly Christians find a little bit divisive at times, and people think that because they're used to standard doctrine and theology, that if you stray from the interpretation of, the standard version, that the creation days of 1 through 7 are part of the first verse 1:1 when God created heavens and earth, you may be, starting to talk a little bit unbiblical. So I'm open to both the gap theory and I'm open to the standard theology. But it's interesting to dig into why people believe there's a gap between 1:1 and 1:2, which I think is the real story. And people accept that, the translations coming out of Hebrew in the Old Testament or perhaps Greek in the New Testament have a standard version. Not quite. There's different possible translations depending on how it mixes with the rest of the narrative. In Genesis 1:1, 1:2, it has some of those very open-ended questions that you could translate that two different ways. And what I like about the gap theory is it allows for a period of time that's unknown, right? Before the creation days of days 1 through 6 and 7. And so whether or not dinosaurs were before the flood and during the 6 days of creation or sometime before that, as what certainly science would say with their archaeology, matters not to me if you're open to that. There's a different translation there in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and you get out of all of these arguments and credibility issues. And so some translations actually will say in Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, it says, "Now the earth became void and formless," as opposed to "and the world became formless." And that's because it could literally be translated both ways. And so if it's now or and, either or, it doesn't really make any difference, because even and suggests a pause or a gap. So it doesn't matter whether you're using the King James Version or other translations, you arrive kind of at a similar sort of issue. And so if we look at what is going on in that verse also, there's another reference that's rather odd, where it has, not odd, but if you link it up with another verse, it becomes a little bit strange, because you have the Spirit hovering over the earth on a formless earth. But if you go to Psalms 104, you have a similar accounting of God sending the Spirit to renew the face of the earth. And this is a creation account in the Psalms. And so all of a sudden you have this renew. And then if you link that gap possible, and this is a renewal of the earth, and or that now the earth became void and formless, it suggests that there's a period of time, and then the earth is where it's thriving, it's destroyed, and then it's renewed. And then you go into the Genesis stories of days 1 through 6 and 7, and that's a time frame down the road. And what's also interesting is if you get into the word form, that comes from the Hebrew word tuhu, and that means desolation or a desert, or figuratively, sort of a worthless sort of thing, which is very, very odd that God would create the heavens and the earth, but he made it desolate, worthless. Because in Isaiah 45, God talks about God where he says he will not create anything in vain. Right? And in vain could be, and that means as it goes on, he informed it to be inhabited. So why wouldn't he form the earth completely done? And then why do we have this verse in Psalms about a renewal of the earth? And then why do we have this gap with and or now and or became? And then when you look at that word vain coming out of Hebrew, it's the word buhu, which is the same word for void in Genesis 1:1-2, where the earth is formed without form and void. And void translates as empty, waste, and undistinguishable ruin. So it's uninhabited, it's desolate, it's a ruin, and that suggests it became a ruin. You wouldn't create it a ruin, right? It would be maybe a work in process, but it wouldn't be created a ruin. So I like the idea of there's a gap there. It's not constitutive to my Christian faith, but it makes all other sort of issues go away, right? I don't have to worry about what the seculars are talking about and every sort of theory of however old it is and how the ages change. And it doesn't really matter to me because I can take that verse either way. And it also seems to me it fits in the angelic rebellion a little better, that at some point in time the angels rebelled, and because of that rebellion the earth becomes void, right? There's something that goes on in prehistory with the angelic rebellion that destroys this whole old order of saurian type of beings, which are kind of reptilian, and I think it answers those questions. But you could also place that in day 6 or days, from days 1 through day 7 with the rebellion. But it gets a little bit more complicated to do that. So if you're asking me for a firm decision on which one I believe, I lean towards the gap, but I'm comfortable with either one.
Wow, thanks for sharing. I mean, there's so much obviously in there, more that we could discuss, but
yeah, you could do a whole show on that. And I'll just let me throw out another verse for some people who want to dig in, and they should read 2 Peter in the New Testament, as it talks about, the heavens and the earth, it was overflowed with water and perished. Well, if that's not talking about the flood, because the earth didn't perish, right? It wasn't totally dead and void. And this was from a former age when you get into the language of that. So I would encourage people to look at 2 Peter as it refers to creation or the flood, however they want to interpret it. But have a look at it in terms of there was possibly a destruction of the earth, and then it was renewed by the Spirit in Genesis 1:1-1:2.
it's very good. And thanks for sharing those other scriptures for people to check out. That's great to take, obviously, the whole scripture in context. My next question.
I have a handout on that, actually, just sort of interrupt. And there's a few more ones like in Job and a few other ones you could check out. But if somebody wanted to get some more information on Genesis 1:1-1:2, I'll lay it out, and I've got all the different words and the translations and the meanings. So if you want that information, just get a hold of me, and I'll send it to you.
That's great, Gary. Thanks. And you can go to genesis6conspiracy.com to get a hold of Gary and connect with him on Facebook. I'll tell you more about that at the end of the interview. But it's a great website. Tells you all about him and his book. So here's kind of a crazy question for you. On Mars, as well as on the moon, are what many believe are like ancient geoglyphs and or megalithic ruins that have basically been photographed by like the Viking orbiter and other satellites. So my question, Gary, is do you believe these could have been built or inhabited by fallen angels and or the Nephilim in ages past?
Yeah, I would lean more heavily towards the fallen angels than the Nephilim. And I know in other mythos, whether it's the ancient alien mythos or some other sort of polytheist religions and slants on it, they have them moving back and forth. But typically the Nephilim weren't really around kind of long enough, although the technology may advance to let that happen. I don't see the time frame, and and as they're advancing that technology, that it permits them to do that for a long period of time. And also, we learn from prehistory, from other religions and other mythologies, is that these gods or angels, they come from other planets or the universe. So they're doing business around the universe, just as Satan does business around the universe in the Bible. And we also understand that all of the knowledge that humans receive, civilizations itself, building knowledge, astronomy, religious, agriculture, comes from these gods, right? Or the fallen angels, depending on your perspective, whether it's polytheist or monotheist. And so when I look at all of that, I look at it as the fallen angels doing things around the earth and building things. Because even the cities, according to polytheist sources and mythologies, will say that the gods built the great cities. So whether it's the 7 great cities of Sumeria or Machu Picchu or any of the great megaliths, the descendants that, as it comes down through history, don't say they built that. It was by the gods. So if there are megaliths on Mars and other planets, and there could be, I think that's more likely done by the fallen angels. And I want to just also throw out another distinction in case you've got some other researchers and people who understand kind of this area that are coming from a different perspective than I am, which is a Christian perspective. And so, like, if you get into the ancient alien mythos or some of the Gnosticisms that, let's say, Lawrence Gardner might talk about, they talk about the Anunnaki and 2 kinds of Anunnaki, a heavenly Anunnaki and an earthly Anunnaki, or as some of them might refer to as Agigi as well as the second order. Well, that's the second order is the earthborn, or the Nephilim as we would understand them. And the heavenly ones are the ones that come from the other planets, just as in fairy mythology, we'll talk about the same thing. So some people will, in some of those other mythoses, will talk about Nephilim as being from heaven as well. That's possible. It certainly would be a standard, but I would interpret that as the sons of God or the fallen angels. If you want to call them Nephilim as fallen ones, as it translates out of ancient Hebrew, that's fine. But understand there are 2 different sets and 2 different roles of what they sort of play in prehistory, and they're not equal groups.
Very good. Thank you for that. In your book, you share how Satan took the form of a seraph when he deceived Eve in the garden, and then how Nephilim possessed basically the face of a viper.
Yeah.
Say that serpents identified as seraphim, and then you also state in your book quite extensively on Nephilim were basically these beasts with long necks and faces like serpents, very similar to how people now mythologize aliens.
Yeah.
This is mind-blowing stuff to consider, and I was really excited to ask you, basically, if you could break down kind of the connection between the seraphim, seraphs, and then these Nephilim serpentine features.
Right. So in Eden, where I talk about in the book about Satan taking the form of a snake, or Nakash as it goes back to in Hebrew, I think you could probably also look at that as Satan just possessing the Nakash or the serpent, right? And people understand that verse either or. I'm fine with either one, again, for the audience, but we're still talking about a snake, and we're still talking about Satan possessing him. Now, where the connections that really become apparent with the serpent, because I think the serpent and all saurian beings are the favored beings of Satan and the rebellious fallen angels, and I'll try and connect all of that through as I go here as well. So when we talk about the Watchers who went to Mount Hermon, that comes out of Enoch, and the sons of God, as it is in Genesis 6, 3, and 4, and 5, going to the sons of daughters and creating the Nephilim through copulation, this was an order called the Watchers. And in Greek it's called Grigori. And they're a specific order of Watchers. And there's, again, these Watchers are known, in my opinion, as seraphim angels. Right? These are the seraphim angels who are the governors of the antediluvian world. And in the antediluvian epoch, you have anywhere from one, which we would know from the Bible, that it talks about at least one antediluvian civilization, to other versions coming out of other religions and mythologies from 4 to 9 civilizations. Typically 7 is the standard, as in the 7 gods of Asgard or the 7 gods of Olympia, the 7 mountains and dragons out of China, and on and on and on and on. So let's say 7 just for simplicity's sake. And these watchers were the governors, and these were cult centers that they established in the antediluvian epoch. So it's different civilizations, whether it's Mu or Atlantis or Asgard or whichever ones you want to sort of utilize out of mythology. Now, these watchers who governed over the earth as being seraphim angels, we first learn about seraphim in Isaiah 6. And it talks about these 6-winged angels in Isaiah 6, and they surround the throne. So again, underlining that they're typically at the top of the order with cherubim, which Satan is also called cherubim as well. And so he seems to be able to have 2 different classifications, but he's one of the greatest beings ever created, right? So you would expect a higher rank and a higher order to what he would have originally done. And he had 9 jewels on his breastplate, which means he might have even been a priest around the throne of God, as with the Israelites, the Levite priests in Israel, they had 12. 9 were the same, and 3 additional ones, and they were able to communicate God through these breastplates. And when we look at that, and you look into the research that Bible scholars and some Bibles will make a note that it refers these seraphims back to the venomous snakes out of Numbers 21. And for people who don't understand Numbers 21, that's when the Israelites are in the Exodus in the desert. They're being attacked by venomous Nakash serpent snakes. And what happens is God instructs Moses to put an image of a serpent on his staff and stand it up, and it's going to protect the Israelites and cure them from these venomous snakes. Now, in every situation except for the image going on the staff, the word Nakash is used. But the image going on the staff is seraphim. So now we understand that these are fiery, serpent-like, and if you take the root meaning back for seraphim, it goes back to a meaning of serpent-like snakes and fiery messengers and words like that. So now we understand for sure that the image of them are seraphim. They look like seraphim, or they look like snakes. And we have a connection here with snakes and the Eden serpent. And then we go to Revelation 12. We understand that Satan is not only the devil, but he's also called the serpent and the dragon. Now, you put wings on a seraphim angel, and it had 6 wings. You have an angelic dragon, right? And you put wings on the serpent in Eden as an animal, because after Eden is how we know the snake, having the legs ripped off and the arms or whatever limbs that it had, and possibly wings, and it was intelligent and it could talk. And in some other versions, like the Gnostic Gospels, it was as big as a camel and very, very intelligent. Just as we're told, it's the craftiest of animals in Eden. So you could have some animal dragons as well, and you also have the angelic dragon. Okay, so when we talk about now these gods and watchers as being seraphim, they were said to have the face of a snake. They had long extended chins, they had very high cheekbones, they had slanted eyes, and they had elongated serpent-like skulls. And they passed on this look in the first generation to the Nephilim, who had the same type of face, and just as an act translates as a long neck. And we get descriptions of these accounts of these Nephilim as well, coming out of like Atlantean mythology, that will have them as blonde hair and blue-eyed, red hair, green-eyed, and aquiline, or these serpent-like faces. And just as the Aztecs and the Miztecs also had the same description as what the Hopi did for the White Clan tribe that comes out of Atlantis to resettle after the flood, and on and on and on and on. And then you have all of these serpent and dragon imagery, not only in the royal dynasties around the world, but also as gods. Whether it's the Ugarit archaeology, where you get these gods and these sort of giant beings with these elongated skulls, you have this consistency of the serpent imagery that I think goes back to emulating the gods and the kings and the demigods of antediluvian history, right? And so if you look at, let's say, a gray alien, he's got this oval head similar to what a snake would have. And sometimes their eyes glow, just as the Nephilim eyes glowed. And but they're quite a bit smaller, right? But they do have this sort of head shape that's very, very similar. Now, under the greater creation concept that I call the greater Nephilim concept, you have other beings being created that are also violations against creation, whether or not it's a copulation with animals or other gods or DNA manipulation or whatever's going on back there that create fantastic beings, whether or not it's things like Pegasus or the Centaurs and on and on and on out of prehistory. But there's also the little people, the little fairies. And the fairies, as I mentioned, as a group, it also has mythologies about these fairy angels coming from other planets. There's 4 classifications of fairies. One is the angelic fairy that comes from other planets. The second one are the earthborn fairies, which are the demigods that they create through copulating with human females. The third one is demons, which are the bodiless spirits of the fairies. And then you have the elementals, which goes into 3 different classifications. You have the mischievous ones, which are like leprechauns. You have good-looking ones that would be like, and they're called the little people, would be like Tinkerbell, I guess would be a good example coming out of Peter Pan. And then you have the ugly ones, which are gnomes and goblins and things like that. So there's many of these little subsets under each of these 3 groups. That's just as Tolkien will take from the ugly group, like the dwarves, which are miners and smiths crafts, right, and the hobbits. And so that's all out of this ugly classification. And within that, there's a classification called gray fairies, and they're known as the little gray neighbors in Scotland, and they're known just as sort of gray fairies around the world. And they have flying machines, and they kidnap people. They do experimentation on people, and they return them after a fortnight or 14 days. And I put one of those accounts in my book. And if you didn't know it was a gray fairy coming through a portal called a Shay with a spacecraft, you think it was a gray alien. And I connect the dots that that's talking about the same type of event that's been going on all throughout our history. As part of this greater concept of creating beings other than the Nephilim that went on and somehow survived.
Wow. Crazy stuff to think about.
Yeah.
In your book, you, I think you might have been quoting an ancient scripture or something somewhere, but it basically stated that all the originating Nephilim mothers died, for their physiology could not cope with such monsters.
Yes.
Many of the Nephilim infants died at birth, with only the babies delivered through a barbaric form of cesarean birth saving any of them at all. Wow, this is incredible, crazy stuff to think about. Can you please elaborate on that part of this whole Nephilim? So
that comes out of the first book of Enoch, which most people like to quote. There's other books like the Secrets of Enoch and the Book of Giants, but this is the one that runs most consistent with the Bible, although it has some variations in it and some maybe corruptions, because we're not sure it's the actual true source. So use it for context. But again, to me, it makes sense that if you're going to create these giants, how could A, they have sex with them, and B, how could they have the babies, and how would the mothers survive? And Enoch says the mothers didn't survive. And in ancient Egyptian reliefs and stuff, you actually see these gods pouring the semen into the women. So you wonder whether or not that's how they actually got the semen in there, but then angels could also be shapeshifters, right? They could take any form that they wanted. So they could be any size that they wanted to. So the sex part's not the big obstacle for me. It's just how do they deliver the babies? And we find out that they had to cut the bellies open from Enoch, and all the mothers were slaughtered. And then they're called sirens for those bodiless spirits because of the violating the law against creation. Enoch goes on to talk about that they're kind of treated like Nephilim, as being bodiless spirits when the body dies, because they violated the laws against creation. And I think what they violate there is what Romans talks about is what can't be forgiven is a sin against the Holy Spirit. As we talked about the Spirit being part of the creation, it gives life. So anything that you violate against the Holy Spirit and the laws of creation doesn't sound like that can be forgiven, just as people who take the mark aren't forgiven of the beast, right? So perhaps something modifies the DNA there. But these sirens are the same word that is used for, and they're out there to deceive humans from that point on. And these are the same word that's used for other variations of mermaids, right? So as it comes down through Greek mythology. And so they're a form of mermaid, and these mermaids, they call people in to deceive them and harm them and promise them good stuff. So there's a consistency here again against the sirens. And so all the mothers are murdered in favor of the demigods that they want to have come out to take over the earth, to take over the kingships, and to enslave humankind in the antediluvian epoch. And so, yeah, it's a horrible thought to think about, but it has so much logic to it that you're going to produce a giant. I mean, how can a human female deliver a giant? Well, some sort of cesarean type of operation went on.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, it really just shows the sinister nature and motive behind the Nephilim, that it's literally, it's not just these females going along with to produce these giants. They're literally dying as these Nephilim are birthed. It's just a crazy thought. Wow.
Yeah, and they may not have realized that that was going to happen to them, but we don't know. They could have been brainwashed and prepared by the descendants of Cain to do this act, and to them. And of course, because the Nephilim, they partner with the descendants of Cain, right? And they partner with the seven sacred sciences and the mysticisms that comes out of the secret societies that the Cainites develop. So it makes sense to me that they would have been well prepared to do this, although they may have been lied to that they weren't going to survive. And we're also told in other accounts that, particularly in Greek mythology, that this just didn't happen on Mount Hermon as what Enoch talks about. Poseidon, for example, he has 5 sets of twins, which includes Atlas, and he creates 10 giants that's going to ruin his empire. But he also mated with many other human females. So it wasn't just one incident at Mount Hermon. And so we don't know how many of these immortal beasts were created in the first generation. But as you go through parallel accounts out of polytheism, you understand that more than just the Mount Hermon account happened.
Right. In your book, you talk about how we can only speculate as to the size of some of the giants and how big they may have grown.
Yeah.
And I guess my question would be, how tall do you guesstimate the original giants were, these original Nephilim?
Yeah. So the first thing is when I do not accept an L measurement as a cubit out of the book of First Enoch, and I know one translation coming down will say L, and the other one will come down of translation of Enoch will be, I think it was 300 L's or cubits, and the other one is 3,000. And again, I dismiss either one because we really don't know what an L is. People think it's a cubit, but that would make these things, 400 feet tall to 4,000 feet tall. So, so let me now sort of tell you how I arrive at the size that I think, and I'll tell you what I think that is. So when we look at Goliath, we're told he's usually 8 to 9 feet tall in most biblical accounts, and they use a standard cubit of 18 inches. And but Goliath, and I make the case in the book that he was the king of Gath, just as the Nephilim were kings and nobles of all of the civilizations. And so there was two measurements to the cubit in antiquity. One was the common gap for building and things like that, and there was also a royal cubit. And so if you're a king, you're going to be measured by a royal cubit. So that would put Goliath somewhere between 10 and 11 feet tall. And then let's move on to King Og out of the Bible, who's the last survivor of the Rephaites. And I take that as surviving the flood because Rephaites are in the covenant land after the battle with Og and Sihon. And Goliath is a Rephaite, and I'll show that in my book as well. So either the Bible is in contradiction, which I don't believe it is, or he somehow survives the flood. And there's lots of accounts in Jewish mythology and other accounts how Og survives the flood, but we don't have that in the Bible other than he shows up just as giants show up after the flood, and not told how that happens. But Og has a bed that is 13 feet long and made of metal. And it's made of metal because his weight was too heavy for wood and it would crush it. Right? So it had to be made out of metal and iron. And secondly, it's said to be 13 feet long using a standard common cubit. But again, he was the King Og. He was a royal, right? So that would put him 15 to 16 feet tall for the bed, or the size of the bed, so 14 to 15 feet tall for Og. So now we're expanding how big biblically that we can get a giant to. I think the original first generation was somewhere between 20 and 40 feet tall. So these were monsters. And, when they talked about bellowing like from the depths of Atlases from the mountaintops, I think that's an accurate description of how these Nephilim, the strength of their voice was. And not only were they tall, but they weren't skinny. They were muscular WWF type sort of build. And so the average height to width ratio of a human is 3:1. But these were recorded in other sources as 2:1. So they were twice as wide. And these monsters were fleet of foot and very dexterous. So they were the ideal archetypical warrior and of great size and lived to great ages. And in fact, the first generation was immortal, except the body isn't. And so that's when the body dies out. The spirit didn't go to sleep, and it wasn't allowed to go to heaven, and that's the demons that roam. So to answer your question, yeah, 20 to 30 feet, but a lot of people will say as high as 40 feet, but I'm thinking around 20 to 30 feet.
That is incredible to consider, 20 to 30 feet tall giants. The book, you mentioned the book of Enoch a couple times in Genesis 6, how they'd crept in humankind through women, and the book of Enoch obviously breaks down how they crept in animals as well. And in chapter 83 of your book, I thought it was really interesting to talk about legends from the island of Crete. And I think it's the bull of, is it Minos or Minos?
Minos, yeah.
Minos, who was this hybrid bull type guy, creature, and how it was known to be a child-consuming cannibal like Moloch. From the Bible that's referenced in the Old Testament was a man with a bull's head who demanded child sacrifices. So kind of twofold. Do you believe these mythological animals, half animal human creatures, such as the Minotaur, were they the creation of the fallen ones? And when we read about Moloch in the Bible, is it more than just this idol? Is it really this living hybrid?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And so, yes, I do believe that the gods, and in this case with the Minotaur, that's from Zeus, right? So, and just as I think some of the offspring also mated to create some other interesting beings down the road. So, yeah, I do believe that these gods did copulate with various animals to create a corruption of the earth. And if we look at that word corruption, I mean it's literally about spoiling the earth, ruining the earth. And I think they ruined the earth with DNA manipulation and through copulation right throughout the animal world and the genomes in the plant life as well, so that the whole earth was corrupted, just as the Bible says. And so, yeah, I do believe that. And there's so many of these other beings. Like you get the Centaur as an example, right? Which is, again, out of Greek mythology. And that's half man and half horse. And that's a union between Ixion and a cloud, which is rather odd in the mythology. But then we understand, again, Zeus being behind the scenes, just as he was with the Minotaur account, he creates a cloud in the image of Hera, which is a goddess. And so Ixion, which is a king, has a union with this god, and they create the centaurs. And so again, we have another parallel account. And just as, like with the Cyclops, you've got that being created by Uranus and Gaia, right? And you have, Pegasus, which is also the white horse and horse god of Poseidon, right? And that comes through this really odd sort of creation, which is, again, a little bit different than just straight copulation. It's mingling Medusa's head with all of these snakes in her hair, right? With the ocean somehow, and somehow with Uranus's severed testicles, which are thrown into the ocean by Kronos in the Titan Rebellion, or the Gods Rebellion, and there's two different versions of that. So I think all sorts of ways that they were perverting the earth. So the answer is yes. And so when you get that down to Moloch, that is a bull cult, right? And where they sacrifice babies. And it's the Baal, and Moloch is the son of Baal, and Baal is the son of the morbid god El. So we have this chain of events in terms of where we're talking about even some offspring producing more offspring in that sort of line. And so Moloch is third in that sort of account, which would be similar to if you look at what's going on. Well, I guess that's kind of second account. I was going to say it's third account with the Minotaur, but again, a very, very similar account in terms of what's going on with the Greek account. And Moloch, he is similar to the Minotaur this way as well, because you have the labyrinth in the Minotaur account, right, which is a significant part of mysticism and polytheism as they're on their journey to godhood, which is what that's symbolizing. But he puts them down, they imprison the Minotaur in the labyrinth, and then they bring them babies and sacrifices continually to feed the Minotaur. So you wonder whether or not this is sort of the Greek version of the creation of Moloch. And then you also have another being called the Quinator as it comes down through some of these secret societies, which again has the head of a bull. And so I think these things are all connected. And if you understand that some of these very strange and ugly beings were also rulers, some of this starts to make sense. Just as if you get into the Epic of Gilgamesh and you have Enkidu murdering King Humbaba in the cedar forest. I mean, this was a complete chimera of cross beings. It had feet of a vulture, and it had a tail that had the end that looked like a snake, and same with this phallus, and it had, I think, a lion's head and the paws of another animal. Like, this is not uncommon, and the chimera is that sort of concept. And then we have, even in the Bible, you have the lion men of Moab. That's after the flood at the time of David. And you wonder what that's all about. And you've got the satyr, or the goat demon god, and demons are related to Nephilim. So were some of those Nephilim like the pan god that had a goat, or looked like Azazel, or whatever other variations of this goat god that you're talking about, or demigod? And I think this was rampant in that antediluvian epoch, and all about the whole idea that the whole earth was corrupted.
Amazing. And with the nature that you talk about the Nephilim having of, just being very arrogant, prideful, obviously similar to their father Lucifer wanting worship, right? It would almost make sense in my mind that if they can shape shift and take on different forms, why wouldn't these fallen angels create some of these Nephilim to look like these gods, to be worshipped and literally throw human babies at them.
Sure, and let's also now connect back to how we started the interview. And so with these dinosaurs, whether or not they're before the renewal of the earth or in the 6 days of creation and before the flood, we're now seeing depictions coming out of science where these dinosaurs, which are basically a serpent-like being, just giant serpents, right, have feathers on them. And if you think about that in terms of, let's say, how Anunnaki are depicted with wings of feathers, and the plumed serpent gods like Quetzalcoatl and Wotan and all the different ones of Viracocha of Central America and North America, you understand that these are serpent-faced dragons, as we talked about earlier, with feathers. Now you have a connection between how those gods are described with feathers and angelic, and a connection to these saurian beings that if they did rule a world before the renewal of the earth or afterwards, that they would have created beings after their own image, right? And when they went to the Nephilim, they're out to create another being after their own image. And they passed on those genes to look just like them. And you're right, they were hubris, they were violent, I mean, if they weren't removed in the numbers that they had grown to from the earth at the time of the flood, I mean, they would have destroyed the whole earth. There's no doubt about it, and it was completely corrupt. They were not only warring with humans, they were warring with themselves. I mean, they couldn't get along with anybody, and they were consuming at such great rates that the humans couldn't feed them fast enough. The people that were enslaved underneath them, they started to eat them, and they started to drink their blood, and blood consumption is a significant part of that trait, which again is started at Babel by Nimrod, according to secret societies, whom Nimrod is their greatest patriarch and first grandmaster of the post-Diluvian epoch, but another rabbit hole to go down. And that's why we have these laws against not only cross-mating animals, but of drinking blood and, you know, eating animals that are sacrificed to idols, because these laws were given to Israel because of what happened in the antediluvian epoch. And so, yeah, these Nephilim were tyrants. And even in the polytheist accounts, even though they might start off as judicious, divine rulers with the divine right to rule, which the kings still like to utilize today, that they say they have, they become evil over time. And they account for that as the human form or part of their bodies corrupting the divine nature. And they become totally evil. And in the polytheist accounts, it's a group of gods or angels that bring about the flood to start humankind anew.
Wow. In chapter 82 of your book, you talk about Leviathan. And that's a subject that's always enamored me and also confused me. And you state that biblical Leviathan was a creature that was possibly more than 900 miles in length with 7 heads, over 300 eyes. So can you elaborate a little bit real quick on Leviathan? And was this you referenced Job, was this partly a creation again of the fallen angels mixing with animals, or was this something else going on?
I think this is something else going on, and I think it's part of the angelic realm or the beings created by God. And so you don't get 900 miles out of the Bible, but that there's so many sources out there on a Leviathan type of animal, and so that people know what I'm talking about. It's equivalent to another name in the Bible called Rahab. You also have Aha and Verta out of the Vedas. This is the same dragon animal of creation. You have I struggle with the Asgard one. Midgardsamur and Lormungagdur out of the Asgard mythology. You have Tapu and Gukamets out of the Kushamaya. In the Miztecs, you have Apep or Apophis out of the Egyptian mythology. These are all talking about the same sort of dragon of creation. And Nahor, Tiamat, Lotan, Apsu, Yam are other names out of Babylonian, Mesopotamian ones. And what's going on here is, let me just back up a step. And the multi-head, you get that out of, I'm trying to remember the verse. I think it's out of the Psalms, where it crushes the heads in plural, and that's Psalms, I think 74, where Leviathan has multiple heads that are crushed by God. So we get accounts of this Leviathan that's exactly the same as this creation dragon out of other accounts, and there's two of them. And in Jewish mythology, is one is created, the female is killed, as I recall, so that it can't reproduce. Because again, what it takes is so much energy or some type of nourishment that it would consume the world because it's so big. Okay, so what's going on here is whether or not it's Pangu out of China, you have a cosmic egg that comes out of this dragon that starts the creation process. I'm not saying this is biblical, I'm just saying that's how they utilize these creation animals in other mythologies. And then whether or not it's Indra or it's Baal or it's Marduk or it's Ra or whomever, is that, or it's you out of China, a god or an angel or Nephilim, depending on how you want to understand that, hits and crushes the head of this dragon and kills one of them, and splits the head open, and they separate it into two pieces, one becoming the sky and one becoming the earth in the creation process as we understand it in the day 6 creations. And this is very similar to what's going on in Genesis, where God separates the water of the universe and the waters of the earth, and then the ground dries out and you get a creation. So you get a separation there, right? And also we understand that God is the one who crushes this, and we take that might be, Yahweh or not Yahweh yet, but Jesus who crushes that, or it could be God, but more likely Jesus, who crushes this this Leviathan in the creation process, with Jesus being the Word, creating the heavens and earth at the command of God. So I look at all of these different things coming together, and we have a dragon that's somehow involved with creation that even the Bible is talking about. And perhaps God does use these type of beings in the creation process that has been lost over time. It's a little bit of speculation, but it's hard to account for why the Bible is talking about, multi-headed dragons or hydras, and they have scales. I mean, in every source you go to, this is a monstrous dragon that lives in the water or the abyss, and that could be the water of the universe or it could be the waters of the earth. We're not told which. So 900 Miles, that Carol Rose, who I used as a quote for in that book, and she has an encyclopedia of mythology from around the world. She uses that and brings together many accounts to come up with that 900-mile long dragon out of prehistory.
Wow. Sorry about the beeps here. I thought I turned on my do not disturb, but
that's okay.
So do your best to ignore that. I'm trying to turn that off. In your book, you talk about flying dragons a little bit, and you say in all likelihood they were a different form of prehistoric serpent.
Yeah.
In the spirit of their kin, the fallen angels. So do you believe, dragons of Chinese lore? And I was going to ask you about the dragons of the Middle Ages, the lore we hear about that. Do you believe there was real flying dragon serpents during the Middle Ages, and were these what you were referencing earlier?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, again, when I talked about the Eden serpent, right? So if you imagine that before the limbs are taken off, that there's different variations of a serpent. Some of them would have had wings, and they're flying animals. And we wonder whether or not that somehow had the ability to have them survive the flood or not, or this. I think most of the birds. I think those again were accounted for on the ark. So one wonders whether or not that's possible with this serpent surviving after the limbs being taken off, and then you have the flood. So you've got a long time period. So I think the flying serpent dragon animal lived before Eden, no doubt about it, as it walked on two legs, or it had wings and flew. I think that is a fairly easy deduction as to what a serpent was before Eden. But surviving into the Middle Ages with the issues of the logistics of what I just talked about, it's possible, but it's unlikely. I don't know how they could fly long enough to not survive the flood. So I think it's more of a, as I talk about in my book and a lot of shows I do, is that polytheism keeps alive their history, their genealogies, and their bloodlines in how they write about these types of things throughout history. And so this is a memory of that pre-Eden serpent that they keep alive. That's what I think that is in Middle Age writings. And most of those Middle Age writings were sponsored by the Templars, and sponsors of the Templars, the royal families, who have an invested interest in keeping that imagery alive. You see dragons in all of their coat of arms. That's because they take themselves as their right to rule back to the gods, and their genealogies back to the Nephilim, and so they're going to keep that as part of their heritage.
Really like that explanation. That makes a lot of sense. It's a memory of a pre-flood era. That's really good. When it comes to reports, the Loch Ness monster, for instance, or other creatures that supposedly have been seen in the present recently on Earth, do you think there's a connection that those are a watery type beast, survived the flood and kept breeding, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of misinformation that's out there, a lot of misdirection, and in a misdirection that sort of, on one hand, discredits the idea of what happened in prehistory, but on the other hand, keeps the mythos alive. And so when you get into those dragon-like monsters and serpent-like monsters like Nessie and other ones around the world, because there's the Ogopogo and the Okanagan Lake, and there's other ones around the world, I think those are more just to keep that memory alive again. But if you get into something maybe like Bigfoot, now you might be into something that is part of that sort of greater sort of mythological survival of some of these beings, like the little beings. There might be a little bit more to that not just a memory, but actual survivors. And again, I mean, the Bigfoot, for example, I mean, they tend to live in caves, just as caves are known as portals in occult mythology, or a shay, as it is in fairy mythology. And these aren't super giant beings, but they're greater beings. And just as in the book of Yasher talks about ape-like beings that are created after the Tower of Babel. Again, that's not biblical, and but this could be to do with that, or it could be doing with just that sort of greater Nephilim sort of concept. And these are obviously intelligent beings because they're able to hide and get away, but maybe we can't find them because they do go through these portals. We don't know. That's all part of that Bigfoot mythology, but they're also hairy. And the reason why I bring that up, if you look at the Anunnaki kings of Sumeria, they were hairy serpent-looking gods, right? And the Nephilim were known as hairy creatures. And the Horites out of Saudi Arabia, known as the Amalekites, as I connect them to in the book, they were known as cave dwellers, and they were also hairy. So I wonder whether or not that greater Nephilim concept of other beings with this sort of common denominator of hair gives it a little bit more legitimacy. But what I always say in regards to any of these beings, whether it's Bigfoot or it's little people, we have to be very, very careful, or aliens, of the misinformation that's being fed to us out there as well, and how that's going to work for the end time deception. So I'm open-minded to all of this, but I'm also very skeptical on it as well, and I kind of remain kind of agnostic. I find the connections interesting, and I love to research that, but I remain open-ended on some of that stuff. But some of the wilder ones like Loch Ness Monster, and I think that's just keeping that's misinformation, keeping the ideology alive.
And thanks for delving into that. In your book, you talk about how because of Numbers chapter 13, verse 32, that we must conclude that the Nephilim survived the flood. And you talk about how dark angels may have provided safe havens that were not on the face of the earth. So my question, I guess, next would be, how might the Nephilim have survived the flood in these safe havens? What would that might have looked like?
Yeah, so you really have about 3 different ways of Nephilim surviving the flood. Just so, and I'll zero back in on your question as I get rid of the other 2, so that people know what we're talking about. One is on the ark somehow, right? Either through the DNA of the wives, because we don't know who the wives really are scripturally, or as the Gnostics believe that Ham was a giant, Tubal-Cain was on the ark, just as we saw in that last Noah movie. That's Gnostic doctrine. Or all the sons were giants, or everybody was a giant on it. Or just as in the epic of Gilgamesh, I mean, not only is Gilgamesh a giant, 2/3 god and 1/3 human, Enkidu is as well, and so is Utnapishtim or Ziusudra, and he takes a whole family of archetypical giants to survive the flood, right? So somehow on the ark is one sort of category. The second category would be second incursion. And what I mean by second incursion is as fallen angels after the flood recreating giants again. Or the third way is surviving on other arks, as like in the Gilgamesh epic, because he's warned by the gods 7 days before the flood, and I already talked about them as being giants. Or in the Greek account with Deucalion and Pyrrha. And of course, Deucalion is son of Prometheus, so whether Prometheus is Nephilim or a Titan god, he's still a Nephilim. It makes no difference. So you have all of these accounts around the world that are talking not about human survival on arks, but of giant survival. And then you also have an account in Greek mythology about the Titan rebellion, where those rebellious giants are put into Tartarus, which is another translation for abyss. And in a lot of accounts, that's how the giants come up out of the earth after the flood to repopulate the Middle East, because that's in Scythia, where Gog and Magog probably get their names from as they migrate in that direction. And Gog and Magog are, you know, words in other languages for giant. And so you have that as a possibility. You have Amakaseth as in the Gnostic religion, where he's another form of Nephilim who's taken off-world in a cloud and protected. You've got mythologies about references, and some people use some biblical references, but it's a little bit vague in my opinion, about a hollow earth or going into the caves and surviving, and in underground cities. And so, or maybe the gods just take them off earth and protect them. Because what we're told in the Bible is that only what's destroyed is what is on the earth, right? Because of the water. So if they're off the earth or protected from the surface of the earth, then they could have survived. But what we do know is whether or not it's Rephaim or Anakim or Avim or Azim or Emin or Zamzuzim and many other names of giants after the flood. These names do not go back to the Table of Nations in First Chronicles or in Genesis, but these were giants. And somehow they're there. So we're not told how they survived the flood. So I lean towards second incursion and survival somehow, some way on another ark as the two most likeliest ones. But I also recognize the third one. And these giants that I'm talking about, they intermarry with the descendants of Noah. So that's why Gog and Magog perhaps take on that name, just as Amalek from the Amalekites probably isn't his name as he creates the greater Amalekite race. He takes on a name of a giant that we can take back to the flood, before the flood, and again, non-biblical accounts. And just as the descendants of Canaan, they like the all marry in with the giants around Sodom and Gomorrah, and probably even with Nimrod will marry in, and descendants will marry in with them. There's many accounts of giants being involved with Babel as well. But certainly Sodom and Gomorrah is thought to be destroyed because that's where these Nephilim in the Gnostic traditions were replanted after the earth. So either second incursion or populating with the descendants of Canaan to create Hittites, Hivites, Amorites, and all the different names associated out of Genesis there as you see the descendants of Canaan.
Wow, it's very interesting about that city, and really makes you think about the story where God rained down the sulfur and took care of business.
Yeah, and so the Gnostics believe that those were cities of light, cities of knowledge. The greatest cities of the post-Diluvian epoch were, again, the Nephilim were reigning and they were developing the 7 sacred sciences. And so they look at God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah as an evil act against their belief system. Just as they would look at the dispersion of languages at Babel as an evil act of God, and as would they look at the flood as an evil act of God.
Amazing. You mentioned in your book somewhere about living giants were publicly viewed as spectacles and wonders in Rome. Obviously, Josephus talks a bunch about giants and stuff, but I guess aside from Josephus, are there other sources that mention giants in Rome? And specifically, is there any record of giants fighting like as gladiators in Rome?
Yes, there are, and I'll cite those in my book just sort of quickly. But yes, there are many accounts of the historians noting a lot of the gladiators and fighters, and other accounts of giants in other regions of the empire. So it's not an unknown concept in the Roman Empire, and actually was quite common. So off the top of my head, I'm not recalling specific accounts, but I've got some references in the book, and I can send that to some people if they're looking for it after the show. Yeah, this was a common understanding of giants, and the understanding of giants isn't a new idea. It's actually an old idea that has been suppressed. And at the age or the dawning of science and separation of church and state and everything that was going on with the development of the Royal Society and the Reformation and things like that, is this idea of giants being created by angels or gods in the polytheist cults has been shoved under the table as they don't want to talk about that. But it was standard doctrine before that. So it's almost like they're embarrassed to talk about it today. But I don't know why the church would be embarrassed to talk about it. It's in the Bible. But again, they're trying to suppress it. And certainly, whether or not it's Josephus, he understands that these are giants. Mm-hmm. and he records them as such. And he also records all these other historians talking about these giants as being actual and factual. And so it's just, as I say, it's more of a recent sort of resurgence that we're talking about these giants of old, but it's been there all the time. And I think the real story is why is it being suppressed?
Absolutely. And it's amazing to me how many fellow believers I know, friends, they literally have zero clue about Nephilim giants, if there was anything going on more than these are just some extra tall people. And it's just shocking to see how well, I would call it a cover-up, has been done.
Yeah.
To keep this truth out there. Obviously there's a reason, and we don't have time to discuss that now, why I believe it's been covered, but it's just shocking to meet so many great believers that have no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people might ask, what about the original church fathers, right? Well, certainly, before we get into the church fathers, you never heard any of the disciples or Jesus dismissing what was talked about in the Old Testament. They relied on it. And even to the point of taking one of the most difficult things to believe, if you're not a faithful Christian, is the Jonah story. And Jesus used the Jonah story of being 3 days in the abyss of the whale and into death as the sign for a wicked generation of who he was. And so if that is just is inaccurate, or is just a mythology, or is just an allegory, then you would say Jesus' resurrection is an allegory. But Jesus was a literalist, right? I mean, he understood things literally and used that for the literal demonstration of the resurrection after the crucifixion. And all of the church fathers were literalists. And that was one of the biggest sort of schisms going on with the Christianity that was forming, was the literal translation of the Catholic Church and their understanding of it at the beginning as it comes down through the church fathers, to a more interpretive version, which the Gnostics and the polytheists have. And so, yes, all of the church fathers took the Bible as it was written in the Old Testament literally. And in that case, it's really hard to deny that they did not believe that giants existed before the flood and afterwards, obviously.
Right. Fritz Zimmerman has written a couple books about giants in the Ohio Valley and giant bones discovered. And he really makes a compelling argument in his books about how what mainstream archaeology calls, Neanderthal skulls and bones that have been found, or the Cro-Magnon types, how these are actually the bones and giants of these, Nephilim discovered. So I just wanted to get your take on that. Do you think that's what's your thought on that connection?
Yeah, so it's hard to understand that the Nephilim as being Cro-Magnon. I'm not sure that those bones are big enough to accommodate the size of what the giants were, because even at the time of 1000 BC or shortly thereafter, Goliath is very large, and we've got 10, 11-foot giants in the time of Rome. So I'm not sure they're quite big enough. But what I do know is that the giant skeletons that are being found in North America are not as ancient as some of these giants that I'm talking about, right? So they're more recent deaths to them. And so that size could have been diluted and diminished over time. So if that's the case, yes, but I mean, Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal excavations tend to have a lot older age. So I'm having a trouble matching that up, because you don't have Nephilim being created till about 3400 BC according to the Bible. So again, I'm having problems with that chronology, but I'm not going to dismiss the discoveries that are being found in North America about some of their and recorded history in the newspaper articles through 1850s to the 1950s, describing these giants of 8 feet, 7 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet tall. And what's interesting about it is they have red hair, just as the Peruvian elongated skulls have red hair. And if you remember, I said they had 2 different color hair. They had red or blonde, according as it comes out of mythologies. And it's interesting that these ones have red hair. So I do find that there's a lot of credibility in the discoveries of these giant skeletons in North America. I'm not there on connecting them with to Neanderthal and or Cro-Magnon, because I think that's diminishing the giants in terms of its size, which has been going on all the time. Is how do you make these go from big to small or normal?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, the elongated skulls in Peru. I've read some stuff about recent DNA testing analysis that verifies some of those specific skulls could not have just been elongated through cranial deformation, because the cranial volume is still 25% larger and 60% heavier than conventional skulls. So, and it appears from the skulls when you look at them that they weren't maybe 10-foot tall creatures or humans, but definitely they look like genetic anomalies, correct?
Yes, yes. And so, again, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, you get a dilution of the bloodlines. You get more human bloodlines and DNA, and you get closer to the size of humans over time. And so if you bind a head, I mean, you can create, and they did this in history for the priests and things like that, so they could emulate the kings and the gods to create that elongated serpentine look. But as you say, binding does not create a larger volume. You can't create a larger volume of cranial just by binding, so it can't be man-made. So this is more, again, almost in that alien sort of ideology of that enlarged cone head, for a lack of another term, that is probably more likely. And if you go into Egyptian reliefs and archaeology, you have a significant amount of these elongated skulls recorded in reliefs or in statues. You know, the Akhenaten, Tutankhamun museums are loaded with these elongated skulls. These are distinct and unique. I'm not sure I've heard yet what the DNA samples are telling us in terms of who these people connect themselves back to, but I'm sure they're probably finding some surprises in that DNA.
Interesting. I just saw a picture the other day in one of these Facebook groups. Somebody was at, I think it was on the Canary Islands, and had taken pictures of a museum they were at, and there was the case was full of elongated skulls, just like you'd see in Peru. It was pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you go into the Mediterranean, whether it's in and around Santorini or Crete or any of those islands, they've got elongated skulls, and there's pictures of them on display, you know, 50, 100 years ago, but they won't bring them out for display today, and they've got huge cranial heads.
One other question, you talk about, you state in your book that completely different Nephilim bone structure may explain why contrived scientific investigations discount fossil bones attributed to giants as possibly, but not conclusively, being assigned to mastodons or mammoths.
Yeah.
So are you saying that, man, some of these mammoth bones that are found in Alaska and Siberia are really, could be maybe the bones of giants?
That's what some of the rogue archaeologists are saying, and that they find these bones. They can't attribute it to the mastodon, but it's too big for a human, so they just either ignore them or assign them to mastodon, and it happens sort of over and over and over and over and over. And just as with some excavations of the little people, smaller people in North America, they just get shuttled away and hidden in the Smithsonian. And there are archaeologists that are on record of saying, I've made these discoveries, they won't publish them, and everything gets taken away and hidden. So I think there's an ongoing suppression of this idea. And I know that gets into conspiracy theories, but I think they're trying to control the information. I really do. I think they'll deal with the information when they're ready to, in the end time, as part of the deception. But in the meantime, they're going to suppress it, because if you all of a sudden open up this whole idea that the whole Earth history is completely different than what they've been brainwashing us with, I mean, you're going to have a revolution on your hands.
Yeah, that's for sure. So all over the Earth, we see these incredible megalithic sites, and that's one of my favorite things to study and photograph. You know, from the walls in and around Cusco, Peru, obviously the pyramids, Stonehenge, I mean, all over. Do you believe these are obvious Nephilim architecture, or what sites, I guess one question I want to ask you, what megalithic site do you believe is like the most obvious pre-flood work?
Oh, I think Machu Picchu and the pyramids. Those would be the most common ones, and it also would throw in their megalithic sites like Stonehenge, where you take in all of the astronomical parts as well, and the weight of the rocks. But from a technology perspective, I look at Machu Picchu. I mean, we can't do that masonry today, let alone how do you get it up to the top of a mountain. And the exacting measurements of the pyramids, and with sacred geometry that goes all the way throughout. And I just look at those, and I know, again, we get this misinformation that these were done after the flood, but that's not what the natives will tell you, and that's not what the religions will tell you. And you've got Mesopotamian reliefs, and you've got other archaeology evidence that shows the pyramids that date well before Chefra and Khufu. I think that really was a renovation that they did. In fact, they're predating that well back into before 3000 BC, with some of that evidence depicting these pyramids before, right, that they can date it to. And then if you get back into other possibilities, I mean, sometimes they might even go to 10,000 BC with the alignments and the water erosion that's on the pyramids. And so there's two schools of thought on this as this comes down. Is mythologies and other religions will tell you that all of the great cities were built by the gods, and then they took them over. And then you have another seemingly period where you have an education of the humans, and they're creating buildings and monuments that are going to stand the test of time as a testimony to the pre-flood and levels of society that was before the flood, to honor the gods, right? And so they're taught that. And I think there's a little bit of both, that because some of these ones go back into the mists of time. And so I think it's both. And it goes to the seven sciences that the occult societies like to talk about. And the fifth science is called geometry, but inside the craft or Freemasonry or the secret societies, that's called masonry, right? That's the art of building, like in the pyramids, to honor their pantheon of gods. And that's why pyramids are so important to occultic and secret society imagery and iconology, because they believe the knowledge that Enoch, son of Cain, passed on. These are Freemasons, and Enoch is one of the greatest patriarchs. The knowledge he developed, and they developed by Enoch and the descendants, was able to build the pyramids. That's their belief, and there's lots of evidence out there, and I put some of it in the book. Whether it's true or not, it's what they believe. And those are the ones who run science. So, which is the misinformation?
Yeah. Wow. I guess two more questions before we call it. Josephus, obviously he's mentioned a lot. You mentioned him a lot in the book, and he's got some amazing giant quotes. Beyond Josephus and like the book of Enoch and the book of Giants and that, obviously the Bible, what other ancient historians or early church fathers speak of Nephilim and the giants?
Yeah, so I mean, Pliny out of Rome would be one. Herodotus is another one, and you've got Tertullian as a church father. Strabo's another one. There's other. I'm not convinced Tacitus does. No, let's not put Tacitus. I don't remember seeing one in there from him. But there's certainly a few in there. I mean, but seemingly, and according to Josephus, all of the ancient historians recorded it as fact. Right?
Wow.
And the Plato one, again, you've got people, and I'll talk about it in the book, about people who are supporting afterwards that the story of Solon going to Sais about the Atlantis story, which is again about titans and giants, is fact. It's not just a fable. So yeah, lots, and Plutarch is another one that would talk about the giants. And again, even though some of these ones will talk about two levels, one that goes back that are fables and mysteries. At the point afterwards, you have still surviving giants that they're going to document.
Speaking of still surviving giants, that's a great segue. My last question. Researchers like Steve Quayle and L.A. Marzulli have recently been sharing these mind-bending reports of what they say are very credible military sources of how the U.S. military has basically seen, killed, and captured living giants over in Iraq in at least 2 different locations when our military was over there, doing their regular duties, came across these giants in caves. What are your, do you think there could actually be living giants, Nephilim left on the earth as these reports would indicate?
Yeah, and these reports are rather interesting. First of all is that, and the size and the descriptions that they give of these giants are very, very similar to what I speculate putting things together in my book as to the size and what they would look like today. They just don't have the serpent face. So they're not like 20-foot giants, but they're probably Goliath type range, and 1,000 to 1,500 pounds. It's still a very, very large giant. And another interesting thing is about what they're talking about. They're living in caves and hiding in caves, just as we talked about the Horites and other beings that seem to be related to the flood and its survival were hiding out in caves. So all of that, and I listened to the interview of the Afghan report on the radio on Coast to Coast, and it sounds credible, and it certainly is possible, but again, I'd like to take that leap, but it just falls short of quite enough that it could still be misinformation. But it's inside information feeding misinformation. So even within inside of that, there's too much there to ignore as just to throw it all away. They're basing it on something. So I think there's something to that. And I also believe as we get closer to the end time, it's going to be like the days of Noah. And I believe that includes all of the days of Noah. I know some people like to narrow that down, but Noah was alive when the giants were created in the 6th generation of Jared that is talked about. And the flood story, which is directly connected to Noah, is the days of Noah as it's recorded in the Bible. And Noah also lived 350 years after the flood. So you've got Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, and giant survival. So I think this is going to become more and more predominant. And as I say, I think they're controlling the information and they're preparing us for what they're going to reveal between history, giants, and whatever is going on with the aliens in the end time. But watch out, it's for deception.
Yeah. Well, Gary, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and interview with me today. It's been an honor. Love your book. And to those watching, you got to go to Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis6conspiracy.com, 6 with the number 6. To learn more about Gary, learn more about his book. You can buy his book there on his website. He's got links to Amazon as well, but if you buy it from him, you can get an autographed copy, I believe.
Yes.
And you can also connect with Gary on social media. He's on Facebook. He's got a Facebook page. I think 2 Facebook pages, just Gary Wayne. And then follow him on Twitter as well, at Gary Wayne 63, GaryWayne 63. Is that right?
That's correct. Thank you.
Gary, it's been a pleasure, man. And again, thank you for writing that book. And I don't even want to ask how many hours that took you to write.
It took a while, let me put it that way. And I took 25% out of the book just to get it down to get it published because I knew it was too large to be published. So.
Wow. Well, thank you for your research. And I've really enjoyed it and just love listening to you. And thank you for being so accessible.
Well, thank you. And hopefully what we talked about, the audience will maybe think about and maybe start doing a little bit more research on their own, because that's what I'm trying to do, is just get information out and connect dots and to get people to revisit and question some of the misinformation that's coming at us all of the time and really sort out what's going on.
I love it. Well, thank you, Gary, and I hope to do this again soon sometime in the future.
Thank you.